Welcome to today's webinar, Walkability and Health, Building Strong, Vibrant, and Resilient Communities, Part 2, Street Design and Placemaking, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I am Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network supported by the US EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that provides current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will post it on our website soon under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to get smart growth news and information and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also learn about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Walkability and Health, Building Strong, Vibrant, and Resilient Communities, Part 2. Street Design and Placemaking. You can also search for event number 920-2186. So to get started, our speakers today are Dan Burden, Mark Fenton, and Danielle Schaeffner. Dan Burden, the Director of Innovation and Inspiration for Blue Zones LLC, has focused his entire career on helping the world get back on its feet. In 1980, Dan created the Walking Audit, a highly interactive way to help people see their community through a sharper, more people-focused lens. The concept is now taught in many universities. By inspiring residents, policymakers, planners, and designers to change their built environments to accommodate people and not just cars, Dan has helped more than 3,800 communities take steps to become more walkable and livable. During walking audits, Dan illustrates the benefits of sometimes simple and often difficult changes and provides a roadmap for people to create neighborhoods, streets, intersections, and cities that are more healthy and better connected. Mark Fenton is a nationally recognized public health planning and transportation consultant and a built environment expert with the Blue Zones team. He's an adjunct associate professor at Tufts University's Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy and has hosted the series America's Walking on PBS television. He has consulted with the University of North Carolina's National Center for Safe Routes to School and the Pedestrian Bicycle Information Center, and has led training and planning processes for pedestrian, bicycle, and transit-friendly designs in communities across the US, Canada, and Australia. Danielle Schaeffner is the Director of Planning and Projects at Blue Zones LLC and is bringing years of active transportation experience and leadership at local, regional, state, and national levels to her work. Danielle's work has included a range of active transportation efforts, including comprehensive and mode-specific planning, health impact assessments, and built environment policy and project guidance. At Blue Zones, she oversees built environment efforts, develops community-based active transportation strategies, and coordinates and collaborates with diverse partners on projects across the country. She has contributed to equity and built environment focused reports and guidance documents. Following their presentations, Dan, Mark, and Danny will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime during their presentation by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. So with that intro out of the way, I'm going to turn it over to Danny. Welcome, Danny.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Please just give me one moment while I set up these slides. Wonderful. So again, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be. If you are joining us for the first time and weren't with us 2 weeks ago, welcome for the first time, and welcome back if you were with us a couple of weeks ago. This is our wonderful built environment team. This is Dan, myself, and Mark. And as you can see, I'm the one without a mustache. Before we go any further, I just want to sort of outline what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to do some brief introductions, and then I'm going to do a little bit of background on Blue Zones and the built environment, and thinking about sort of the here and now and how we're thinking about our planning practices and the core of the walk audit as a tool. Then Dan's going to move us into what you're actually looking for on these audits and connecting on. And then Mark's going to wrap it up for us with some tips and opportunities and what's next. So who are we? You've seen us, and maybe you've met us or interacted on one of these walk audits with us or community efforts with us. I'm going to give both Dan and Mark a little bit of time to introduce themselves. Dan, would you like to give a 10 to 20 second introduction?
Yeah, sure. So pleased so many of you have joined us today. I am delighted that we can now share some of the techniques that we use. I know everyone across America is learning their own unique art, but we thought we'd share with you what Mark and I have done, and now thousands of walking audits. So it's great to make your introduction. I'll be able to speak with you shortly. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Mark, would you like to give a brief intro?
Hi, Mark Fenton here. I live in the Boston area, but I'm lucky to work with this team that's spread across the country. Actually, I'm an engineer by training, but don't hold that against me. And I'm also, because I really have spent a lot of time at the nexus of engineering, land use planning, and public health for over 25 years. And it really started back when I started doing my first walk audits with Dan. So I really feel privileged to be part of this team.
Great, thank you both. And hello again, everyone. I'm Dani Schaeffner. I'm the Director of Planning and Projects here at Blue Zones. I have nearly a decade of experience in the built environment, have worked at local and state health departments prior to joining this awesome team. I am a trained educated epidemiologist, planner at heart, and part of my brain is engineer. It is a joy to work on this team with these folks. I've been with Blue Zones for the last year and a half, and I'm just excited to be here with you all today and have this conversation. So now that we've told you who we are, we would love to know who you are. So here you'll see some options. Please just let us know what you most closely associate with, what resonates the most for you. Again, knowing that some of you may connect with more than one of these.
I'll give everybody a little bit of time to respond. And if you are having trouble getting to the response page, if you're in full screen mode, you may need to close that out so that you can get to the poll question.
We know that this is an imperfect list, but we're just trying to get a feel. So pick the thing that's closest to your area of interest, even though it may not be precisely what you do at all in your work.
Okay, Danny, can you see that on the screen with the 74% planning, 11%
I sure can.
infrastructure, economic development, and only 2% elected officials?
No, this is great. So thanks for participating, everyone. Yeah, it looks like we've got a lot in the planning realm, some really great representation from health and the infrastructure realm as well, and then some elected and economic development practitioners as well. That's great. Thanks, everybody. It's good to know as we move forward in our conversation. So just a little bit of background on Blue Zones for those of you that may not be familiar or as familiar. Blue Zones is founded in the research and discoveries of our founder, Dan Buettner, who was asked as a National Geographic explorer to look for places around the world that were experiencing longevity. And he found these 5 areas, these communities where folks were living to 100 and beyond at higher incidence than almost anywhere else. And it begs the question, why and how? And what Dan found with his team was that there were these common threads in these communities that they all had really ingrained in the design of their day-to-day and their community design in and of itself, the ability to eat local healthy foods, connect with one another, engage in purposeful gatherings, acknowledgement of their own purpose to stay naturally active in their days without necessarily having to sort of carve out for exercise, as you will. And so really what these communities had done was ensure that healthy choices in their communities were the easy ones. So as we think about in our built environment team, Mark, Dan, and I working in the communities across North America that we do, when we think about how we bring that conversation around healthy choices being easier, more accessible, more affordable, we think about that in terms of the policy systems and environmental changes that a community needs support on to get to that next level of health and well-being. Many of you likely know that the environment is one of the #1 indicators of someone's health and well-being. And as you can see here, depending on where you live, work, play, there is huge impact. These conversations very much integrate with what we are experiencing now. We can't have these conversations without acknowledging that COVID has not only highlighted but heightened inequities, specifically racial disparities. We also know that many folks have awakened to the pervasive systemic and institutional racism that exists in this country and has since its inception, and also that exists in our profession, right? Acknowledging that there are many of you on this webinar from the planning profession, we have a responsibility to recognize and reflect on how these practices need to change. And I say that as we in the built environment team at Blue Zones really think about this as having these main urgencies, if you will. So thinking about how do we approach design conversations differently? How do we increase representation in all aspects of our work and of our interactions? And then last but definitely not least, how do we redefine engagement? And I circle this one and focus on it the most because it is most relevant to what we are talking about today, which is the critical element of the walk audit as a tool in street design and placemaking. So when we think about engagement, as many of us I'm sure are having more conversations even now than before around this, we need to think about not just who and how, but where in the conversation this starts. Oftentimes, I think we find ourselves checking a box or integrating this piece as sort of a middle of the conversation element. And it's really important that we create this as the defining initial moment of the things that we do in these other buckets. So before I say a few more quick words and then tee it up for Dan Burden here, I do want to just sort of gauge your level of experience and work with walk audits. So if you would look at this great poll that Michael has put up, if you could select one of those as the one that most closely relates to you and your experience, we would appreciate it.
Thanks, Danny. And those of you who have the opportunity to respond, we'll give you some seconds to do so. And again, if you're having some issues with getting to the screen, exit the full screen mode. This does seem to be a bug in the GoToWebinar platform.
And again, just pick the answer that's closest to your experience. We're just trying to get a sense of how widely walk audits are being used around the country. And this is a tiny barometer of that because it gives a sense given who's participating in the webinar today. Oh, great.
Okay. So you can see those responses there. First exposure and been on some being the leading, and only a few do it routinely.
This is great. This is great. Well, I'm glad that this is for some, maybe many of you, something of a newer idea around that engagement. Seeing that almost sort of a split between this is your first exposure and that you've been on some. I'm going to now move and sort of talk about just some of the things that I would urge us to think about as we continue to listen to Mark and Dan. But I want to just take, one more minute and say the community walk audit, as we think about redefining engagement, is such a critical tool. This is the opportunity to create a bridge with a community to really share a space and an experience and engender a power shift that we know is necessary. So what I would leave you with is these pieces. I would say the most important things as you conduct a walk audit, prepare for a walk audit, have conversations afterwards, is to, one, engage fully. This is not a standalone and it's not a one and done. This needs to be integrated with debrief. Folks need to hear their voice coming back. Otherwise, we have done more harm. And Mark will speak a little bit more to the debrief elements a little bit later. The other part about this I want to just mention briefly is that it needs to be integrated with other engagement activities. So this is one great tool. It is not the only tool. So make sure it is not the one and only. The second point I would make is ensure that there is representation of and from the community. And this involves some pre-work, really engaging and making sure you know who those thought leaders are, and then making sure that the where and the when of that audit allows for that space, allows for the time that those folks do or don't have, and really centers on a space that they resonate with and that they have either concerns or priorities around. Third point is make sure that the talking and the listening is balanced, that voice versus ear. And balance doesn't mean 50-50. It really means offering your insights and even some of those tools, but then being consistent in sort of that step and lean back and making sure that the listening and the learning that you as a facilitator or a supporter will offer then gets integrated into those next steps and into your support of that community. And the last one I would say is sort of dovetailed with that last one is we need to continue to acknowledge expertise and the different methods around that. I think experts often come into these conversations meaning well, but really adhering to sort of the terms and the language and the criteria of a profession and of a structure that has existed already. And so I think we really need to listen to participants and these communities as they are the experts in their own experiences, what is most important to them, and what's really front and center as the thing that needs the most attention around, a concern. So with that, I am going to leave you in the very capable hands of Dan Burden, and he is going to lead you through a technical conversation about what you're auditing. Thanks so much.
All right, and I think this is a smooth transition. I'm sharing my screen now, and hold one second. I think there it is, full screen. So last time we met, those of you who were able to take part, and anyone can go back and watch part 1, we covered sidewalks. And this session, we're going to get into the many other things that you discuss on a walking audit. I always cover crossings, intersections, non-signalized, signalized, and when we have the chance, mid-block crossings, trail crossings, but then I get into the street type. So I'd like to share vocabulary that we've learned to discuss through the years. And but I'm going to give you just a real brief element on the sidewalks. Last time we met, we were able to cover comfort, width, condition, setbacks, very important, the feeling of security, and the level of shade. And so just real quickly, I'm sharing with you some of the nomenclature that comes to us through engineering, through landscape architecture, and additional language that we develop just to enhance and improve walking. So these are just examples of those elements of a sidewalk. And then to understand, every sidewalk stands alone. It depends on where you are as to whether you must attach it to the street. Certainly when you get into steep grade like this, it's impossible for anything financially affordable to move the sidewalk back. So you add the bike lane, and that gets the buffer that the pedestrian needs, and has many other wonderful effects, including calming traffic and so on. So I wanted to show the diversity of sidewalks. But let's start with fresh material now. And as I mentioned, we always get into crossings. It's just essential. If a person can't get across the street, then we don't have good music, and we don't have opportunity to move from place to place, visit shops on the other side. Whenever I can, I will lead a walking audit or precede a walking audit with an in workshop setting, maybe just 20 minutes, but I like people to understand what the complexity that the engineer faces to make crossing safe. Intersections by definition are a place that you go to have conflicts. For pedestrians, there are 24, you can see them mapped out here. And it's a very complex thing to build a safe intersection. And for many reasons, pedestrians choose not to cross at a crosswalk. So when I see behavior like this, I know they have not put the crossings in on a great enough frequency that many people find it is safer, and it truly is safer to go mid-block if the conditions are right. And so it's up to the engineering and planning communities to figure out when and how to place good mid-block crossings. So we're going to get into that in detail. But I want to also have a good discussion on how many players there are in building a good intersection. So the one on top is the same as the one on the bottom. But I want to point out it's more than just what the engineers do. It's what the planners do to get the right block frequencies, what the architects do to enclose the street, and no single profession can handle a improved walking condition. So this is an important point. Let's see if, there we go. Now let's get into the non-signalized intersection. They're the simplest to introduce, but we have many issues. The markings, what is the speed of traffic, the width of the curb radii. I really want to make an emphasis on that, and we'll talk about that. What is the proper lighting? And any intersection should be well lit. And then what's the visibility? And then the type of traffic control. So let's start with one of the most important, and that is the radius. Here's Kara Seidemann in Cambridge with probably a 2 foot, what would you say, Mark? A 2 or 3 foot radius?
Yep.
Outside. Yeah. But
Yep.
here's Michael Walwork, where he was actually almost taken out about 6 seconds after I took this photo because the radius is so wide. Even though he had the green signal or the walk signal, the motorist was not going to yield to Michael. So keeping the radius to the right level is the most important thing to do to come up with a compact intersection, whether it's signalized or unsignalized. So as a compact, unsignalized intersection, be thinking, if you would, what treatments you see here that you like and which ones you might enhance. And in just a moment, I'm going to ask Mark to talk about the things he sees here, and then I'll show the answers I've come up with. Mark, what do you see here that you find inviting for a small compact intersection?
Well, it's a great example. On the right-hand side there, we realize that whole sidewalk is essentially a curb extension along the plaza there, right? You see the parking lane, but then you see that the sidewalk for the length of the whole intersection on the right there is pulled out. You also see two tight radii on the street to the left where the pedestrian is crossing, and just past the fire hydrant there. Meaning nobody's going to take those turns at 30 miles an hour. You can't do a big sweeping turn here. It just doesn't invite it. And I have to acknowledge something really important. We'll get in conversations where somebody will say, yeah, but the biggest fire truck in the fleet or a tractor trailer truck can't make it through here. And so there are two questions. The question number one is, should a tractor trailer be able to get through this street? Maybe the curb radius doesn't have to accommodate that. And the biggest fire truck, if it were allowed to swing into the opposing lane, it probably could, and it usually can. That's available to it. So don't let that be the only criteria you use when thinking about curb radius, because this feels to me for a residential street like the design might be just right. And in fact, they may be missing a curb extension on the left side there where that car is almost backed into the crosswalk where the pedestrian is.
Excellent, excellent. And by the way, I personally feel that if you're crossing a side street, it's okay to have less emphasis marking. These aren't bad, but definitely for the street that's got the majority of traffic, you must use high visibility markings. I personally like 10 foot as a minimum, not 6 feet, and make it the full width of the ramp for the crossing. This one could be a little better, but I would rate this easily an 8 out of 10 in scoring an intersection, with the curb extension being wonderful. We probably could have curb extensions on the near side as well. To really make that point about the importance of curb extensions, notice this intersection has 66 feet if it does not have curb extensions, and only 22 feet of exposure. Much better sight lines for motors to see pedestrians, likewise for pedestrians to see motors. Really powerful effect. Now let's go to the tough one. Signalized intersections. And again, we look at almost all the same categories, but we now add in some other tools that become important when we apply. So let's get into the details. I have never found a intersection I'm totally in love with. There's some that I'm pretty close. The one on the lower right is what I consider the most perfect signalized intersection that I've ever come upon. It's Washington, D.C., Connecticut, and K at a major subway station. And it's got very wide crossings, and they're pretty well marked. And notice all the post-mounted signals, something that we'll talk about in a minute, but just a beauty. But the one up on top may be in the bottom third of the intersections I found. In fact, notice there are many mistakes. I count 48 different mistakes in the ones you see here. Another one that I like to accent the qualities of a good compact but signalized intersection. This had been a 4-lane street. It's now a 2-lane street, but widened at the intersections. That's where you perform all the work. Notice how wide the crossings are. The radii are as tight as they can be within reason. When you add bike lanes, you can tighten down the radii even more, simply because the receiving width becomes greater. Same thing would be with parking if you didn't have curb extensions. Mark, what would you add to this? What do you see that you like with this particular intersection?
Boy, I'm pleased about the, how they deal with the transit stop, and sort of keep that central to the, so often we see transit stops down the street. We don't talk a lot about transit during this workshop, but frequently in our walk audits, it's central. And if you look closely, you'll see the transit stops on both corners are close at hand. You put a transit stop at mid-block, you make users go way out of their way or cross mid-block, right? So it's a little thing, but it's sometimes we overlook that, but not on the walk audits. We make sure to talk about transit too. So I'll just add that as something different that we sometimes forget to get.
Excellent, excellent. Now I'm going to do a quiz for everybody here. This won't be a poll just for time's sake, but notice this intersection has 4 different crossings that we call those pork chop islands. If you look at them from the sky, they actually look like a pork chop. But it seems like they assigned a different engineer to each of the 4. There's one that's much safer than the others. I hope each of you have picked number 4. It brings the motors in at the lowest possible speed. It gives them the greatest sight lines, and it's not even perfect. Pork chops can be designed so much better than these. But look at number 2. Motors could enter that crossing easily at 30 miles an hour, and the faster they can go in, the less likely they're going to yield to a pedestrian or even see them. So again, this one is kind of bizarre. It's though they had no rhyme or reason for what they did, but somehow by chance, number 4 turned out to be a better intersection crossing.
Can I throw a point in here quick, Dan?
Oh, please, let me go back.
One of our jobs, and it's great. Illustrate it with that photo. Go right ahead to the photo. Remember where the driver is looking as they're entering these slip turn, the slip lanes, the right turn lanes. The driver's often looking left, right, to check whether there's traffic in the lane that they're entering, meaning they are not looking right toward where the pedestrian could well be stepping off of the curb to make the short cross from the curb to the crossing island. So if you think about a driver who's looking left there, you got to think about what can I do to give that pedestrian a better position, right? More visible to the driver, not let them sweep into the turn at speed, knowing full well the driver's actually often looking out at the travel lane.
Excellent. And on this one, not only do we have the pork chop islands designed a little better, but notice on the left where cross street comes in, there is a drop median that extends out. That slows the motorist who's doing a left down a lot. You might lose a slight amount of capacity.
I'm fearing we just lost Dan. His sound dropped out. I'm not sure if that's the case. I'm gonna give him a second. He's had a little bit of intermittent internet trouble. I guess I will reiterate the point he was making, though. That's a really important point about the pork chop island, because, or about the median island, because that left turning movement, imagine the slow pedestrian who gets caught halfway across the street. They could have real trouble, and giving them that refuge is very important. Dan, you back with us?
It looks like he's offline right now, Mark.
Oh, all right. If you'd like, we could switch to me. I don't want to. Maybe we should. Why don't you go ahead and give me the screen, guys, if you want.
And Mark, I know Dan is actively trying to rejoin, just an FYI.
Yep, good. Is it good with everybody if I go ahead and jump on here, and then
okay, go ahead.
What Dan's going to do is have us do a few more, look at a few more intersections here, and he actually does some really nice pre and post work So again, we might on the walk audit ask people to experience this intersection, either look at it or even cross, if we can do it safely with the group during the walk audit, and then say, give us a score, you know, how do you like it and what does it do? And then what we really love to do is invite them to imagine how they might improve it, right? So we might say, you know, and you can even render that. So this is actually a photomorph, right? A rendering of how that intersection could be done as a single lane, you know, modern single lane roundabout. And by the way, one of the ways to keep the capacity up if you need it is to still keep turn lanes, slip lanes like the one here on the right. So there is a pork chop island here that allows, but notice that you've broken the pedestrian crossings up into a lot of individual one lane crossings. No pedestrian is ever facing multiple threats at any time, even if you do allow for this right turn vehicle movement here. So these are important things to think about and to get participants to imagine when you're out there doing the audit, right? That sort of paint some of these pictures. Often Dan will give a talk beforehand and show images like that and say, you know, what could you do with this intersection? What do you like about it? What's working for you? What's not? And this is a great example, by the way. This is the perspective of the driver who's coming in. And if I've got a green light right here, I could well be just looking left, seeing if there's traffic coming from the left, and before I make my decision to go right here. So we want to be very aware of that. Dan next was going to talk about mid-block crossings, which I think are really important. And thankfully, we're seeing a lot more receptivity among engineering departments to do this kind of work. So on the left, you got a couple of examples where the mid-block crossings look a little bit like afterthoughts, if they are even formal crossings at all, versus, you know, really high quality stuff. And I say all this acknowledging not everybody can create an environment like the picture in the top right there. Vegetated median island, big trees, all of that. But there are, you know, elements of those that I think we can take and should think about. And again, we're back to this idea of separating the task, allowing the pedestrian to cross at least with a finite number of well-defined conflicts rather than having to run out to the middle, because we regularly see pedestrians in the picture in the lower left here, literally going out and using the turn lane, as you see with the two pedestrians at the very bottom of the left picture there, using that turning lane essentially as the median, right? They'll get halfway out, wait for a break from traffic in the other direction before moving ahead.
Hey, Mark, I can,
You're here.
yeah, I
Carry
got
on.
back up, but I'm back. Yeah, and just so we don't have to go through reconnecting my screen, let's just have you.
Yep.
Screens. Beautiful job. Thank you for doing that, Mark.
Not at all. Carry on, man.
Yes, so I'm now wanting to go to the next screen and talk about signalized mid-block crossings. And this one is one of the best I've ever found.
Mm-hmm.
It is Rodeo Drive, most famous. And but notice all the things in this one that really makes it work. Again, as we saw earlier, the curb extensions eliminate the site design problems. They help slow down traffic, and really well-marked crossings along with the median. But look at the beautiful signalization. You've got post-mounted signals, and on the left side as well as the right. So we love to get the multiple signal heads on any treatment we do. Mark, would you add anything to this one?
Oh, no, sorry. Other than we acknowledge not everybody can do this. You can take elements, though. What might work? You know, so if I can't do all 6 of these things or 8 of these things, what pieces can I do that work in this location, right? Context-oriented design. We get that totally.
Excellent. And the next slide shows the names of things. Again, you're all going to have access to all of these images so that you can be reminded of the tools and so on. So now let's get into trail crossings. And with trail crossings, same type of tools. Sometimes they're played out a little differently. We'll go beyond the title slide. And one particular trail crossing that I like is this one. It's in Davis. Notice what they've done here, and it's the first time I've seen this. They force the cyclists not to just approach directly, but to go around so that they're looking at traffic from both directions before they enter. And it's really well done. I believe this is only a 1-lane crossing. I think the immediate lane is an additional use, but it's well done, and based on volumes, based on speeds and other issues, what additional tools the engineer brings in. Let's go to the next Davis mid-block crossing.
Do you want to mention, by the way, that the Z offset here also forces the pedestrian or the cyclist to look toward oncoming traffic as they pass the center island?
You
right?
just did, and you did it real.
Yep. Just to make sure that that combination is really improving user sort of eye contact in both cases.
Absolutely. I have mixed feelings about this one. I love the width. I love the fact that it's a raised crossing that slows the motorists down. I am not an advocate of putting posts where the pedestrian or bicyclist is having to deal with encumbrances put into trails, but they've done a splendid job, I think, in bringing the speeds down and putting a number of the other elements together. Mark, what's your feeling on these post-mounted?
You can't help but, you know, if we're really trying to do inclusive design and think about people across the spectrum of ability and disability, a visually impaired user, pedestrian, could walk right into that with, you know, there's no curb level warning if I'm using a cane, for example, to warn me of this. So I think from a design standpoint, we'd expect a more thoughtful application. If we think we need to put posts there to keep vehicles from turning onto this, recognizing it's not a motor vehicle lane, and I understand that tends to be the reason for that, then let's think about how we do it in a way that's going to work for all users, including, for example, a visually impaired user.
Absolutely. And on the next one, I love these lean rails. It's the tool I picked up in Australia and brought back to the country, but that allows the bicyclist to put an arm down, not have to come out of the clips or whatever, and it increases the yielding behavior of bicyclists. But look at the excellent markings and well done, both pavement markings and signs and so on. So let's go to the next one. And by the way, one of the tools I love is when we make the ADA openings full width of the crosswalk itself. You can't always do it, but it's just so many benefits, and certainly true with the bicycle trail where you want the freedom for bicyclists to be able to go both directions at the same time. You need that full width. So well done. Let's move to the next one. Now get into the streets, and I'm going to start with local streets. Again, these issues you're going to see on other categories of streets. Local streets, I personally feel, should never be marked for more than 20 miles an hour. It's a local street. It's all about access. And there are many elements that go into a great local street. If we're going to have the actual speed, what we call the target speed, be the same as the performed street, then all of these elements are important, including the on-street parking. Moving to the next. My first example, and we'll come up with the labels for this one, are shown here. Think about the things you like. What makes this one unique and distinct? In a minute, you'll see the labels. There are some things you might not be as familiar with, depending on what your trade is, what profession. Notice the curbless edge, no curb. This can be useful for a number of reasons, but drainage would be very high. I also personally happen to like valley gutters. They're not always appropriate, but they give an extra visual tightening to the lane itself. And with that, what would you add, Mark, that you note about this street?
Notice that there's still a vertical curb over here on the edge, so we're keeping the vehicles from parking beyond where we want them to. You know, you really define the parking lane here, which can be important depending on what's going on back of curb, right? And whether the sidewalk's right there, or in this case, we have the nice separation. But so there are times you don't have to do the same thing everywhere. Curbless on the left because we're allowing drainage to get, you know, natural infiltration over here, stormwater running that way. On the right, though, we want the vertical curb. It's okay. That's what engineers and designers should do. You know, design to the context and be clever in that regard.
Absolutely. Now let's go to the collector street. As we go up in the function of the street, the collector collects all the traffic off of the local streets. My personal feeling again is collector streets should not be fast. They have a very important role to play. All they really need to do though is make sure they handle the volume of traffic and not induce too much speed. 25 is fine for many. 30, yes. When I see a collector at 35, I just go crazy. Why did you need to do that? You either built a bad system that you're having to move more traffic at higher speed, but let's try to keep everything sensible. Note that all pedestrians, bicyclists, everyone are forced out into the collectors off of the local streets at some point. We've got to keep them sensible. So moving to the next slide, and this gives us a contrast between the way this street was designed and this is a pretty high-speed street. Most motorists would probably do 35, some even faster. And there's no reason in that. You hit your maximum capacity in a road somewhere between 25 and 35, but 30 is plenty fast if we're worried about capacity of a street. So let's go to the next image. Same street, and with this visual, you can see it's not just the width of the road that induces certain speeds. It's the color. Notice if we colorize the bike lanes, colorize the third lane, that road, which is still exactly the same width, will be driven very differently. Having the vertical elements, trees, lamps, very important. And then the eyes on the street. So it's not completely up to the engineer to come up with the right speed. It requires the practicing landscape architect and architect. Mark, addition?
And I'm going to even add that your zoning code matters. So in other words, bringing those building fronts to the street change the visual aspect ratio of the corridor. Even if you don't move the curb line, there are studies that say drivers will behave differently just by virtue of a single-story building becoming 2 stories, or a building that's set back 60 feet being only 20 feet off the curb line. They change the visual aspect ratio of the corridor. So your land use and zoning requirements play very much into how the street feels.
Excellent. Go to the next, and with the next, that's still a collector, but notice the challenge the engineer has. They were able to come up with a detached sidewalk for the most part, but for some other land use function, the immediate block, they had to go to an attached sidewalk, but they made it very wide, and with the bike lanes, it's not as bad. I love the triple canopy. There's so much more the landscape architects should be able to do to engage, not just to make roads beautiful, attractive place, but to help bring down the speeds. It's a partnership. Mark?
Yep, I think that it's one of the important points as we're looking at these kinds of images is when you're leading a walk audit, you're going to get amalgam scores that sort of pick up different things, right? An 8 comes from some mix of those, and not any one of these things is the critical element. Part of what we're doing here is showing you images to sort of fill your mental reserve of the potential things that you can bring up if the participants don't. I'd much prefer this come from the group organically, but if it's not, you can throw out questions that might lead them to thinking about the canopy and how many trees there are and how good the shade is, or how much separation they've got from the lane. That's part of your job as a facilitator, not to tell the answers, but to evoke people's observations.
Fantastic. And on the next one, this is a community called Watercolor. This is a state road, a coastal road in Florida. I consider this almost nirvana. If I had to take credit for any particular street, which I did not design this one, I would want to take credit for this. Notice all the beauty they've added in, the eyes on the sidewalk, the street. This road probably rarely sees traffic speeds above 15. And yet it's a major state road along the coast. It connects into seaside, other important places. But look at all the tools they used. And hopefully as we're going through this, the tools that do the most are becoming very common in the language. Quickly, let's move to arterial streets. I'm trying to watch the time. Again, you'll see mostly the same techniques. The higher we go up in category, the more critical it is to be able to support bicycling as well as walking. And so let's go to the next element. And with this street, you see a regular 5-lane road. Again, this is an arterial, but then you see the modification of a street, different locations, of course. But look at all the beauty that goes into the lower element. Narrower lanes and bike lanes, good buffer, good buffered landscape medians and nice setback sidewalks. So let's go to the next one. You see the details of this happens to be Mesa, Arizona. Very well done. And go to the next one. You see some of the names. Mark, what would you add?
Oh, yeah. Only that you got to acknowledge not every community is going to have the same resources. So let's realize not everybody can plant vegetated medians, and you know, in a place like Mesa, you'd have to irrigate that. So you know, you're going to have to think about what works for your community. Can you use native species? Can you use another material? In New England, we often see things like crushed shell in a median that's a lower cost to maintain than a vegetated one. And sort of I always on the walk audit invite that kind of creativity.
Excellent. Okay. We are running out of time here, but I want to just give you a few more visuals. So, Mark, if you'll just click through.
And I'm just going to keep moving through some of these that are showing, you know, different manifestations of the tools, different locations around the country, you know, and sort of the creativity that local engineers, designers, planners have used. And a willingness to, again, design to the context. I think that's just the most important thing. I can't say that enough. And part of what you do on the walk audit is invite discussion of that. We have a section here, Dan. I think I'm a little ahead of you. I think your internet's still a little slow. We're now to the Main Street images. And yes. I'll just say here, needless to say, you're going to expect a lot more activity when you have, you know, Main Streets sort of have retail districts and very multimodal. You'll notice the curb extension on the left here, where bike parking. So they created the curb extension, but they also utilized the space for bicycle parking, which is really important, right?
Absolutely. And this is a one-way street. For Main Street, we usually like to keep them two-way, but they wanted to max out the parking. They did a great job. What's fun about this image is that the one-way terminates at the center of the length of Pacific Avenue. So you only get to go halfway. So it really helps keep the speed down. This is a very masterful job of engineers and planners working together. Do I have control of the screen again? Or
I don't think so, Dan. I think it's still with me just because of your slow internet. In fact, we're up to the sidewalk parts, and here is where you remind people that there's kind of a furnishing zone, the walk zone, and then the shy zone that's at the building front. I think that's probably familiar to a lot of the planners. You know, that's kind of a standard. There's a great shot from Holland, Michigan here. And acknowledging that, again, those are going to be different in different places, but that they are really instrumental, particularly in business and retail districts, to get it right. Oh my gosh, this is Harvard Square, right? This is a shot.
That is Harvard Square.
Where my daughter spent the last 4 years, and I spent a lot of time enjoying all that retail and the exceptionally pedestrianized sort of environment there. Huge volumes of traffic, by the way. It seems like, and yet it is so designed with the pedestrian and now the bicyclist in mind. Contemporary shots of this, you know, just recently, excellent bicycle lanes are, you know, far improved through this area.
Absolutely. Let's get into trails security, and we're going to go real fast because I want to turn this over to you, Mark. But I didn't want to overlook something that we just haven't put enough energy into. So the first image you see of trail security, notice that this is a small little pocket mixed use area, and very important to put the eyes on the trail. On the second image on trail security, beautifully done. This is one of my favorite trails in America, North America. It happens to be Vancouver, but look, how well they separated wheels from heels. Foot travel is next to the water always. The bicyclists, though, have their own wonderful berth. And with that, Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you so that we can stay on schedule and have plenty of time for discussion.
Excellent. I just want to point out on this slide that Dan does not take credit for those people in love at the right on the picture there. He's just saying space is provided, but he's not going to take credit for that.
No.
We're going to conclude by, I'm just going to wrap up. You know, these great slides by Kevin Lynch. I'm going to urge people to take a look at some of Kevin's material, which you can find because his taxonomy of the urban environment is really worthy of further discussion. And you know what? I guarantee, Dan, you can get into that in part 3 of your presentation next time when you rejoin. But all of this, by the way, the taxonomy of the urban setting, I think it would be fair to say walkability is the thread, right? Or multimodalism. Let me say that. Let me say, you know, getting out of the motor vehicle is sort of the thread of building the livable city. That's one of the central pieces of Lynch's. Wouldn't you agree on that, Dan?
Oh my gosh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I discovered Kevin late in my career, but boy, he's right at my arm's reach always. Beautiful. It's one of the best books in our professions. Yep.
So I'm going to wrap up just with some really practical tips, if I could. Ask the question about virtual walk audits. There's a lot of work going on around what can we do during a period when we're not gathering in groups of more than 10, when we necessarily can't be out in the field altogether. And I'm going to go back to Danny's opening challenge about participation. So this will be fairly practical, kind of wrap up in the last few minutes here. But we go to a poll question, and this I'm going to make a really important point on this. So on this poll, we're going to ask you a simple question. If you were to look at these 5 images, 5 conditions for bicycling, I'm asking you now as a viewer to respond. What is the least amount of protection you'd be comfortable with when you were out for kind of a continuous bike ride? You're not just going for 30 seconds to the corner store. You're going to be out for a little bit of a ride. Which of these is the least amount of protection with which you're comfortable? Just on street, with a sharrow, an actual bike lane, maybe a buffered bike lane with some physical, space separation, or actual physical separation from the travel lane. So, John, if you put up that poll now, you've got these 5 images in your mind. So what I'm asking you is to think about which of these is, and you're going to go ahead and answer. And again, think of the 5 images and which sort of carries the day for you. And again, no right or wrong answers here. We're just trying to get a sense of people's comfort level. What kind of bike lane, or bike facility are you comfortable riding on, basically? So 5 choices there. On-road, no bike lane. On-road with a sharrow, with a traditional bike lane with just a 6-inch painted stripe. A painted stripe that's 18 to 24 inches of separation from traffic, and then an actual physical barrier. So as soon as you hit the submit on that, that'd be great. By the way, these are a range of conditions, and I know some of you, there are variations on this, how these tools might be applied, different conditions. But I'd love to just see where our comfort level is a group, and then I'm going to make an important point about this.
Okay. I think we'll close it momentarily here. So it's interestingly, it's toward the higher end, 28% with the buffer, 26 traditional, but quite a fairly even range, actually, I would say.
Great. I was kind of hoping for this because what it suggests is there's a lot of breadth in our answers, right? If you think about it, there are some people that say, look, if you don't give me, I'm most comfortable with the protection of a protected bike lane. And the reason this is an important question is it's a matter of perspective, right? And your background. And it also, in one regard, completely misses the point. So let's go back to the picture. The question we could ask ourselves is, which of these works for you, right? And spend all of our time talking about, well, we want a buffered bike lane or we want a protected bike lane. And number one, let's consider that we, perhaps professionals that work in this field, might be much more skilled cyclists than the folks we're talking to. So we may be more comfortable with number 1 or 2 in the images here, where we know that some evidence suggests as much as 60% of the population really wants some substantial, but they might want a number 4 or 5 before they're going to ride any distance. But there's another point. What about the perception of the population that looks at the bike lane as an absolute intrusion in their neighborhood, or the first sign of gentrification, the first warning that displacement is coming? In other words, we totally missed the boat if our entire conversation is around what kind of bike lane, assuming we want to build a bike facility, when the residents in our walk audit, if we've done a good job and we actually have residents from this neighborhood, they might well say, you know, we're concerned. You put in a bike lane, what's going to happen is that's the beginning of the people starting to buy up and build high-end condos here, and then the folks who live here being displaced as land values go up. And the thing we want before a bike lane is affordable housing, or some policies that will protect affordable housing or protect the businesses that exist here right now. Even if some of that change does come economically, we protect the people and the businesses that are here now. My point is, we're right back to where Danny started the conversation. If we don't have the right folks in participating, then we certainly won't have ever heard that answer, right? We'll end up talking about the bike lane and miss entirely the more underlying point. So let me just give you 5 or 6 quick practical points from having done lots of these about scouting your route beforehand, scoring, these 6 things. I'll touch each of them. Note the picture to the lower right, by the way. I've got to give credit to my friends at the University of Montana's Rural Institute for Inclusive Communities, and actually my friend Kathy Kostakis at Montana Department of Health, and Meg Tracy at the Rural Institute, where we started doing what we called inclusive walk audits, where we very specifically reached out to experts in disability and disability-oriented design. And you'll notice now in the series of photos, you're going to frequently see people using wheelchairs, people who are visually impaired or blind. And the point is that's because, as a matter of course now, if I do a walk audit with that team in Montana and now increasingly around the country, we make sure we reach out to include participants with expertise and or lived experience. And I think that's an important takeaway lesson, you know, that I can talk about designing for a wheelchair user, which is still dramatically different from having somebody who uses a wheelchair on the walk with me and participating and adding all of their expertise and lived experience. So having said that, I'm going to just make a couple of quick points. One, I like to select my route and even select routes thinking about where the teachable moments are. This is a walk audit in New Bedford, Massachusetts. I had scouted ahead of time, knew that we were going to have to walk on a sidewalk that was not set back from the road, and we knew it was going to be a rainy day. They had the that was one of the YMCA, that was one of the co-hosts, had umbrellas available for everybody, and I didn't mind everybody getting splashed because it drove home the point about having separation distance between the sidewalk and the curb edge. We also discovered this path, which I actually knew existed, which was a shortcut to the backside of a Walmart, but I let the group discover it, or hoped they would, which they did. They said, yeah, I think local kids use this as a shortcut. We found a bike leaning up against and attached to a sign behind the building. And I said, do you think that's that could be an employee of this Walmart? Should we formalize this route rather than make them cut through the bushes as they apparently do now? Another thing, we've talked about scoring. Dan and I have mentioned it a number of times. Here I am asking the group, give me your numbers from 1 to 10. We're in Livingston, Montana, looking at a junction between a trail and on-street facility, a beautiful trail along the river there. And everybody's shouting out their numbers. I actually pass my hand over the group and say, give me your number from 0 to 10 for this section that we just walked. And what that does is, by the way, it gives everybody voice, right? Everybody can say, and the person who says 2, when everybody else is saying 8, is often the person I go to first. And I'll say, your 2 is important. What did you see that somebody else didn't pick up? And they might say, well, you know, I feel like I'd be nervous here at night when there's no lighting. I'm a woman walking alone and it's dark. Would that be safe? Great perspective, right? I also love to co-facilitate. When Dan and I, or Danny and I do one together, we'll often spread ourselves in the group. Somebody will be up front leading, somebody else will be further back, picking up observations people are making as we're walking, such that when we stop to do these conversations, you can say, hey, Bob, you just said a really interesting thing about the curb back there, that ADA ramp. Tell the whole group. We love to experience the group. Dan showed some pictures earlier. I love building a curb extension, or maybe a median island, or even a little mini circle on a very quiet neighborhood street, but actually having the group experience the space physically. And my point here is only, it gives a sense of dimension and depth. You know, we can make a 4-foot wide curb extension here, but by physically building it, you can kind of show geometrically how traffic can still navigate, how, yes, indeed, a big truck could still make the turn if a moving van or the big fire truck in the fleet still has to come to this neighborhood. It's fun, it's lighthearted, but it's also instructive to do this stuff. I think Danny said this, I think Dan has said it a bunch of times, and I certainly beat the drum on this. It's got to be an act of shared discovery and shared solutions. It is not the expert telling everybody else what the right way to design this road is. And by the way, the expert sometimes, certainly it can be, you know, the public works director who comes along and says, well, we're never going to put those curbless lanes in because then we'd have stormwater problems and everything else. You know, and maybe that guy has never, that person has never taken training in low impact development practices. So we caution against letting somebody dominate the conversation. But on this bike ride on the left, these were demonstration bicycle lanes that Blue Zones worked with Richardson, Texas on. We did a bike audit there, and one of the advocates sort of was a self-proclaimed expert and kept telling us why this kind of bike lane won't work for this kind of rider, and really was kind of dominating the conversation. My job as a facilitator was not to say he was right or wrong, but rather to make sure that other voices on the ride, including some less experienced cyclists, were able to weigh in. Right? We've got to make sure that every voice is heard and not just the expert is dominating the conversation, owning it. We've alluded to this, but I'm going to really drive this point home. And Danny said it up front, not one and done. Your walk audit has to connect to the ongoing work in the community. There are lots of ways to do it. We can invite people to sit down, draw pictures. How would you like that intersection to look? What would make this main street feel really fantastic and pedestrian and all person friendly to you? Drawing on maps, potential routes, the number of times people identify and say, yeah, there's a shortcut. The kids use it all the time to cut through to the school here. Let's identify it on the map. Could we formalize that? But if we can't do that, I never, ever let a walk audit end without at least polling the group and asking everybody for their 1, 2, or 3 best ideas. And I say 3 because Dan and our friend Pete Lagerway actually taught me this years ago. I can challenge the group to think about the 3 Ps: program, project, and policy. Program, in my mind, is defined as the kind of the behavioral stuff we might do, an encouragement program, we might do education and outreach, we might put on an event. Project are the physical infrastructure changes to the environment. What did you see on the walk that you would physically like to change? Repaint that crosswalk, put a curb extension here. But policy sort of is the gold standard. You know, why only put a curb extension at this intersection? Why only a roundabout at that intersection? Maybe we should have a roundabouts first policy where anytime we analyze an intersection, we ask, could a roundabout work here first before we put in hundreds of thousands of dollars of signalization that we know has, in many cases, shortcomings? So program, project, policy can be a great frame for the closing discussion. And that sets up perhaps the most important thing: what next? What are we going to actually do with what we did on this walk audit? Where's it going to take us? So thanks to Danny, when she was with the Hawaii State Department of Health, I was able to work with their team doing walk audits in Hawaii, and the picture on the left is from one we did together in Maui. In a couple of things immediately, you can imagine people talked about the lack of separation between the sidewalk and the parking lane there. You know, not an elevated curb allows people to park their tires up on the sidewalk, narrow the walkway. They also pointed out a lot of intersections there, big, wide, sweeping turns. We're right back to Dan's point about curb radii. So what were some of the ideas? Well, the programmatic idea, this is close, this neighborhood is close to a school. Maybe we need to do a walk to school program, walking school buses, you know, sort of activities around promoting walk to school. Maybe we could create some curb extensions, but we're not going to be able to do those gold standard concrete with planters and everything else that Dan showed some of the pictures of, but we could paint them, and maybe the kids could be involved in designing and painting the curb extensions, as you see on the right here. And we'll use vertical delineators to create some actual delineation, get all the benefits of a curb extension. That, in fact, is the mayor who spoke about this as it fit into the complete streets policy there. So all 3 levels: program, project, policy. And I'm not saying the walk audit is the only reason this happened, but I think it certainly helped that people got out on the ground, experienced this environment as pedestrians, and the notion of what next, not having to be $1 million project, but some fairly low cost intervention like paint and vertical delineators and coordinating it with a walk to school program, very, very beneficial. Last couple of thoughts. Can we go virtual? I think it is viable to do so, and I'm going to give just an example. I'm not going to give a full talk on virtual walk audits. I'll share the idea. I worked with the Safe Routes to School Student Ambassador Program the YMCA of New York held. We had hoped to convene all these students and many more. They're not all pictured here. It was a great program. We had hoped to meet together in Albany and do a walk audit together, and then the kids were going to go home and bring walk audits back. They couldn't, right, due to the pandemic. So what did we do? Well, they came up with really clever ideas. I share Matthew Tobin from Tappan Zee High in Orangetown. He actually created a Google Doc of a virtual walk audit. There's instructions there. He then told people, think about these 4 things. This is stuff we had talked about through a series of webinars. He actually showed people the map of the route he was going to take them on. He invited, by the way, local officials, school officials, public health, transportation, safety, public works. And then he took them on a walk. He said, okay, we're going to walk this block, and here's where the concrete sidewalk is. Here's the crosswalk right in front of the school. Here's a part of the asphalt sidewalk. Another, he had a series of photos. Some of the students used little video clips, and then he asked them to rate, and then he asked them to react. Tell me, what do you like? What didn't you? What might you improve? And he got responses. In fact, some of the students that tried to do live Zoom walk audits didn't have success getting people to sign up, but they did when they made the Google document available, and if they said, do this anytime in the next week, they got feedback from community participants. My point only here is, let's be at least as creative as those young people who showed me a half dozen different ways to think about walk audits than the way I'd been doing them for 35 years. And my last point is this, the most important, that kind of a tool could be one of the many tools we need to bring to bear to create truly inclusive and interdisciplinary walk audits. I've often said they've got to be interdisciplinary. I need planning, and I need public works and elected officials and health and the economic development folks. But I also have learned in no small part, starting with my work with Meg and Kathy and others, that they've got to be fully inclusive. And I've got to reach out to the people, as in San Jose there on the left, we were doing a Safe Routes to School program where a large portion of the community Spanish is the first language spoken. And so that meant we had to include translation and the materials printed in Spanish. And it was absolutely the right thing to do, because as soon as we got local parents and kids out on these walk audits, we learned things that we were gonna never learn if we just left it to the school officials and public works and myself to divine what a good walking route was for the students to school. And we need to do that everywhere, all the time. Reach out to the residents who have the lived experience in the communities, the people who are every day trying to cross that intersection, get their kid to school, get to the public library. That's where we're walking in Tallulah, Louisiana, there on the right. And that public library is really important because it does a lot of the social service work in that community. It's a really important institution. So they said the walk audit should go by the library, and I would maybe not have known to do that without the input of the local residents. It may be the most important thing we do to have an effective walk audit, particularly now at this time in this country. As Danny said, I think one of the most powerful things we can do with somebody with whom we've been estranged, who we haven't connected with, we don't even see eye to eye, is to take a walk together. So that's what I'm urging you to do. I think Dan and I would say, if you could get out there and take a walk with somebody, maybe the most powerful thing you could do to start to take us on a new path. 3 resources I'd like you to be aware of. That group that I just talked about is actually hosting a session on inclusive interdisciplinary walk audits on July 24th. My good friend Charles Brown actually gives the opening plenary there, and then you're going to get some very practical insights from participants and organizers on how to do that. It's a nice extension of the conversations we've had in these 2 webinars. I'd urge you to join that if you can. There's a link here. The AARP thinks about inclusion across the age spectrum, right? And have got a wonderful walk audit toolkit and leader guide, very simple, but a nice starting point if you're thinking about this. I certainly urge you to take a look and download it. And of course, the National Advocacy and Education Organization, America Walks, has many activities on their site, information on their site, but one of the activities I really love is their walking college, which really is geared to train walking advocates. So I'd put that to your attention as well and suggest also a good resource. There are many more. I don't do justice to many friends and colleagues that have done a lot of work here. I just thought these were 3 nice starting points, and I'd certainly urge you to join our webinar on the 24th. So with that, I'll take a breath. I'll throw up a slide here with our 3 contact points. We welcome contact, follow-up questions, but I think we're gonna have some time for conversation now too, if I'm not mistaken, Michael. And by the way, our thanks to Michael and John for bringing us. I wanna say that from the whole Blue Zones team. We are so appreciative of this opportunity to join you guys all.
Yes, thank you, Mark and Dan and Danny. And we're going to take questions for maybe another 20 minutes or so to 2:30 Eastern time. We've gotten a number of them. You can continue to submit them on the questions tab. And we'll remind folks that the prior part 1 is on our website, the archives page. This one will be, and we are talking with this group about doing a part 3 on implementation in a month or so. So go ahead and ask Mark and Danny at least to put their webcams on. Not sure about Dan because of his situation with the the internet connection. But I guess I'll start with one of the responses to looking at the protection on the street for biking, because we did get a couple of comments back about that one, and maybe you can respond to this. So here's one from Elizabeth Maxwell, who said, I think the bike lane I'm comfortable with is related to the street itself. I'm good with a sharrow because those are typically on a local street, but I would not do a sharrow on an arterial. I would require the lane with a physical barrier on an arterial. The higher speed of traffic, the more protection I need.
That's spot on. I'm just going to jump right in and say we didn't give you nearly enough information to really make the call, because you're absolutely right. Speed and volume, turning movements, how many driveways there are. There are so many things that you would, curb cuts. All of those would dictate whether a protected or a separated bike lane. We're starting to see even protected bike lanes that are placed behind a parking lane, that is sidewalk, bike lane, parking lane, right? And then travel lane. But then potential conflicts at intersections. You don't want bicyclists coming out from behind a row of parked cars. So you've really got to do, and there's some great material on that. I think NACTO, National Association of City Transportation Officials, has done a beautiful job. Their Urban Bikeway Design Guide really talks about many of the things Elizabeth alludes to in great detail, shows examples, schematics, but actual real world examples and case studies. So fully mean to acknowledge that. I do think, though, there's an underlying point here. Danny often talks about the 60% cyclists. If we imagine the world of bicycling from the strong and confident cyclists that may make up some number of, 5%, 10% of the cyclists, and those that say, I'm never going to cycle for any, significant amount, maybe a third of the population. We think there's something like 66% of the population that would like to cycle more if the appropriate treatment were available to them. And to Elizabeth's point, that appropriate treatment is going to be different on different roads, but they want to know I'm supposed to be here as a cyclist. Don't just toss me into the great unknown and expect me to feel comfortable out there. I'm not an experienced enough cyclist, so do the proper treatment for the conditions to make me feel like I'm supposed to be here, and to let drivers know I'm supposed to be here.
And Mark,
Well,
I would just add to that too, that we're seeing more planning and network processes really center around that level of traffic stress, which is really meant to take it from the perspective of the person, in the motorized vehicle to the person on the bike, right? So addressing the things that Elizabeth is bringing up right now about, say, how do you build upon that network based on what that stress is to the bicyclist, and what do you therefore need there? So we'd be happy to send a few of those plans, to Michael and John if folks are interested.
Great, thanks. And I can't tell if Dan is frozen there, so we'll go ahead and move to the next question. And maybe Dan, you want to turn off your camera. When conducting a walking audit, is there one specific walk audit guide that you would recommend? It's a routine question I receive from community of partners up to state officials.
So hard. I will say the AARP's guide is a really nice starting point. It's very much oriented toward advocates, not necessarily professionals, but that doesn't mean it's not useful for professionals. I think it's useful for professionals to look at it, and because then you have context, right, about how would a non-professional, how would an advocate think about a walk audit like this. So, and they have, by the way, an adjoining leader guide that is a little more technical. So it's not just what is a walk audit, but also how might you lead or be a facilitator. So not a bad starting place. And then they have references and resources in those documents. So, so I'd commend that as a good starting point. Maybe we should get Danny, get Dan to, since he's not on right now, let's say Dan's going to write one. Yeah, that's what we'll say. Dan will write the definitive walk audit guide.
Can he hear us?
I'm not sure. It looks like he's trying to log back in again.
Okay. I love that idea, Mark. I love that idea. The only thing I would add to that, Mark, is, and I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback, so I'm not sure why. But the only thing I would add to that is, to Mark's point, there's a lot of great tools out there. But if you have the ability and the connection to a community, create a tool that resonates for that community. Have the conversations and the questions. This is one of those spaces where I do think less can be more, when you're coming to that community and having these initial conversations about what the things in that tool, that are missing maybe, and what their lens are. I'm sorry if that was hard to hear.
There was a little bit of feedback. Dan, are you back with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Got knocked off again. So
Yes. Okay. Well, we'll just
I'm
keep
going to leave my camera off.
Okay. Well, we'll just keep moving with the questions since we've got so many here, and I think we've responded to the other ones. Here's one from Nick Ruiz. Have you done a pedestrian delay audit on any of your walk audits where you measured the delay in walking time caused by lengthy signals, multi-stage crossings, etc.? This is one of those things that discourages walking that I don't think is talked about enough or quantified for decision makers and engineers to act upon.
Well, I gotta say that Mr. Ruiz is spot on, and I admit my failing regarding quantified measures. So we'll talk about that qualitatively all the time in walk audits. It's a really common sort of subjective measure, but I think he makes a really good point. You know, we regularly talk about traffic delay and we'll quantify that, right? Make an objective measurement and saying, oh, they had to sit through 3 light cycles to make a left turn here. But never talk about the challenge that a pedestrian faces in that exact regard. And why, by the way, often pedestrians will make decisions like when Dan showed the photo, choose to make that mid-block crossing rather than deal with the multiple conflicts or the multiple crossings required to get out to a pork chop island, then cross, then off of that other pork chop island back to the main street at complex intersections. That's just one example of the many kind of delays that he's alluding to. And I think we should do a better job of that. I agree, and I'm going to admit that I've not done much quantification work around that. But very explicitly talk about it and try to get people. Let me just say this, though, however, if I may, the Federal Highways Administration published just in the last couple of years their Guidebook to Pedestrian and Bicycle Performance Measures. Let me say it again, FHWA, I think it's 2016 dated, Federal Highway Administration, Guidebook to Pedestrian and Bicycle Performance Measures. And I have brought that to bear in a number of communities. In other words, when communities are talking about how do we really measure the performance of this roadway? How do we get at the challenges faced by the pedestrian and the bicyclist, not just think about motor vehicle level of service. The guidebook lays out something like 30 other ways to measure the performance of a roadway, from economic outcomes to public health to pedestrian and bicycle delay. So I would strongly recommend that, because I guess it has the imprint of the Federal Highway Administration, because they've sort of deigned it as sort of best practice. We'll find that engineers often in institutions that really are bound to stay with what the guidebooks say now can do so, right? That guidebook opens the door to us having discussions about the very kinds of measures he's alluding to as a performance measure for a roadway. So I draw that to your attention, and I'm happy to give you guys, send you, John and Michael, the link for that so that we can get that out to the group, because I think it's a very good reference guide. It's well organized, very readable and accessible. Say it one more time, Federal Highways, because if you just Googled these words, you'd find it. Federal Highway Administration Guidebook to Pedestrian and Bicycle Performance Measures.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that that the whole slate of tools engineers have been working with on traffic signalization and capacity are just leaving the pedestrian out. And we look to the most modern states for what they're starting to do. And the tools are out there, but they really need a lot of work. Yeah.
Okay. Here's a question that may be towards Danny's work a little bit, from Connie Bernardi. How can public health and other advocates maximize their clout and influence they have in design when they do not have the professional engineering or planning training?
The short answer from my perspective would be your expertise is just as valuable. Your voice is just as valuable. I know there are folks on this webinar that have worked directly with me in this job and in previous jobs, and they will tell you, I just invite myself. I have been that public health practitioner. Mark's laughing right now. I am a public health practitioner, even as I sit here in sort of this plan engineering world. And I think really ensuring that even just asking the question, because sometimes those conversations are so full of the people that are almost too immersed in it, right? And that comes back to, I think, what I was saying earlier, is that there's a need for sort of that refresh. There's a need for some of that, deconstruction and reconstruction. And I am biased, but I think that public health professionals, advocates, community members, you pull that seat up. I think you have tremendous value, and I don't think it means that you have to have all of the same expertise. I hope that's helpful. Mark, if you want to add, or Dan, if you want to add.
I'd love to add.
Yeah, go.
I'm not an engineer. I've probably trained more engineers than anybody, but Danny, you're exactly right. It's like that profession needs a boost from outside. People that look at it from a fresh perspective. Are you meeting the objectives of building the kind of community you want to live in, that work for your parents, for your children, for yourselves? And we should never lose fact that engineering has not been allowed to be designing for people instead of motorists. It's time to refresh, restart, reboot, whatever. Yeah.
Having said that, let me add, though, that Danny has assiduously trained herself in fields like planning and engineering. She's taken advantage of all the resources available. She immerses herself in the technical stuff. She can talk LOS, ADT, MUTCD, AASHTO, every acronym you want. She's right there. She's not going to get kerfuffled by the classic sort of acronym brush off that sometimes technicians, so I'm an engineer by training, right, we will use to tell non-technicians, yeah, you can't really do that here. The MUTCD says you can't. So it is fully appropriate. The question that was asked is appropriate. We do need to learn that language, become conversant. You don't have to be an expert in roadway design, but you need to be conversant so you can be shoulder to shoulder with somebody on a walk audit and understand what they're saying. Having said that, I give Danny much of the credit for helping me realize that as an engineer, I'm a public health practitioner too. So in other words, part of the job is to say to the planner or the transportation engineer or the economic development officer or the elected official especially, whose mandate and the zoning ordinance, that the first words are health, safety, and welfare of the community. You are all public health practitioners first and foremost. I guarantee you the enabling legislation, the ordinances, the guidance that they get, you look at engineering manuals, those words, health, safety, and welfare, right up front. We're all public health professionals. So you as a public health professional need to help remind them of that, as Danny does so well all the time, by the way. Thank you very much.
Well, you guys are really kind. And again, obviously this question has spoken to all of our cores, but I also just want to add to that I think public health has this incredible opportunity and bridge and niche in that we are natural facilitators, right? So to Mark's point and to Dan's point, to be able to speak enough to those other sectors, to be able to be glue in those interdisciplinary efforts, and also to be a bridge to and for a community. I mean, I place tremendous value on that. So I'll leave it there. And hopefully that's helpful. Also, you have my email, so I love to talk about this stuff, obviously.
I think we asked the right question there for everybody.
Good question.
So we'll move on here. Do you have any suggestions or resources for thinking about winter cities and walkability? The audit tool seems to be generally neglect winter season issues. I'm writing from Winnipeg, Manitoba. We have at least 5 months of winter.
Well, that's totally a fair question, and it means I did a bad job, and Dan, we both blew it here with our photo selection, because I've done walk audits in Anchorage, Alaska, and a lot of Minnesota cities and towns, Houghton, Michigan, Upper Peninsula, Michigan, they get a lot of snow, we have found, and by the way, often we are asked, well, we can't do a walk audit this time of year because of the weather. I'll say, no, on the contrary, this is precisely when we should. Let's see where the snow piles up. Let's see where the frozen water is at the bottom of the curb ramp, right? So that we've created the most dangerous condition right at the bottom of a curb ramp at an intersection where our drainage isn't working. So it's a great point. We do them. I don't, sadly, personally, can't recommend a great resource for winter cities. Other than what I often will do is connect winter cities when I'm doing work with them. In other words, find a peer community that is doing this kind of work and has had some success around their trail network. So that's Houghton, Michigan, for example. They have as many miles of trail as they do on street facilities. And so when somebody's talking about trails in winter cities, I'll often say, let's connect you with those guys. You know, what is Minneapolis? What's their snow clearing policy around the trail network? Well, in Minneapolis, you know, some of their trails, their multi-use trails, are primary snow clearing routes. I remember the story of in South Dakota, Rapid City, South Dakota. I was in town for a walk audit. The beautiful trail, the Rapid Creek Trail, was plowed after an overnight snowstorm. And I said, you guys are showing off because the walking guys in town. They said, no, that's a priority snow clearing route, because we know if we don't clear it, the kids who normally would walk to school on that route will be driven, making our arterial snow clearing, particularly near the schools, really hard. So we've resourced, our snow clearing policy includes resourcing a trail width plow and manpower to get that thing done after snow. So I believe everything we talked about is relevant to winter cities. We just didn't sort of pull those specific tools out as examples, but you're spot on to think about it, and don't hesitate to reach out to us for more on that, because I know Dan's worked in a lot of winter cities as well.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that if you're doing a walking audit in the winter and you get a snow, and you can pretty well play this one out. I once did one in Hamburg, New York, definitely in the lake effect snow. We built mini circles out of snow and curb extensions. In the fall, you can use leaves to do the same thing, right? And so, no, the being in a winter city, you actually have more resources, but don't let the snowplow operators design your streets for you. They do a terrible job.
But lest we make the snowplow operators the bad guys, what Dan means by that is, remember we talked about inclusive workshops? I want the snowplow operators or the head of that team or whatever on the walk audit with us. I want his or her perspective. I want her to say, you know, this is a problem. These curb extensions that are really squared off with really, really tight radii. Okay, what design would work for you? Could we try some stuff? Could we get some of you and your drivers out and test some temporary treatments that we've made with paint, with removable bollards, with vertical delineators before we started pouring concrete, so that we don't set up oppositional relationships, but we acknowledge that best case design takes all of those perspectives into account. It's just like the fire truck and the tractor trailer truck, right? We engage the experts in those areas in the process to create a design that includes everybody's perspective.
Well said, Mark. Well said.
Great, thanks. So I think, well, why don't we go another 10 minutes or so, since we have so many questions. And then what we can do, since we're talking about part 3, I can send you all these questions, and then maybe you can build some of that into your last session.
Of course,
we always get more questions we ever have time.
And the guide that Dan's going to write,
absolutely.
Remember, he committed to writing that a minute ago, so put him in there.
Well, fortunately, he agreed to do that while he was
That's
offline,
right.
so
That's right.
appreciate that.
You'll have to fill me in what I'm doing, Mark.
Giving you plenty to do, Dan. I know you don't have enough time. Here's the next question. In addition to design changes at intersections, how responsive have engineers been to signal changes, such as an all red phase or single phase light schemes, which help with Vision Zero type policies by putting the pedestrian crossing safety and time ahead of vehicular delay?
I'll give just a short answer on that, which is there are a lot of tools in that toolkit, right? Leading pedestrian interval, all red, you know, scramble timing, or Barnes dance, as some call it, override. So let's not forget transit, right? So you know, signal override for transit, and you know, which can be combined with like a sort of dedicated bike transit lanes. I'm seeing amazing innovation in this area, and I'm finding engineers, my experience just initially, very receptive, because if you've got decent research on some of this stuff, how the leading pedestrian interval works, for example. And let's go dedicated signalization. So how about bicycle signals on primary bike routes, right? So you could do easily a 2-hour webinar just on that toolkit. So it's a great question, and my base observation is surprising willingness from engineers because they see the challenges, right? They're out there doing it every day. And if these can help them solve the problems, and if they have a Vision Zero priority, they are willing to use these tools. I'm seeing more receptivity than even 5 years ago around a lot of these tools.
Absolutely. And one really good example, when we do one style of our walking audits, it's called a mobile study tour. We go to cities where the best, most innovative engineers are working, and they not only explain the tools they're applying, but how they are able to do the analysis, the research. Boy, do you ever see the pens come out with the engineers visiting that community? In fact, in Hawaii, Danny, maybe you can speak to this. We did so many very successful walking audits, mobile study tours, that after a while, Hawaii, your department, started to bring those engineers into Hawaii to share the tools, right? Do you want to talk about that?
I think that could be a long conversation. I do want to underscore that, Dan, and I want to also sort of highlight what Mark was saying. And this happens to be a Hawaii specific example, but not only have I and we collectively been in communities where we've seen that pen come out and we've seen the notebook and then we've seen change, or we've seen that light bulb go off, right? Because again, I think as a shared experience, when you have somebody out there, even seeing somebody on a bike, walking, struggling to get that prioritization or struggling to interrupt that cycle, or watching cars sort of fly through it and every other mode just sits there and waits. We were actually on a Mark and I were actually on a walk audit in Maui. The wonderful engineer on the walk with us just went, "Oh, cool, I get it. I'll change that." And literally within a matter of days, that intersection operated differently. And so I say that to not say that always is the case, but I do think that, again, to bring it back to this tool and how it can really sort of operationalize that idea. And I think the walk audit sort of into that mobile study tour idea of taking someone to a different environment for multiple days, I think that only solidifies and allows for even a more comfortable space and saying, oh, that might work here. I see how that works, and it doesn't necessarily feel like a judgment on how their own space and community is working. So that's what I would add to that. But yeah.
And I'll add to that, Danny, keeping in mind that engineers are problem solvers. That's why they went into the craft. And they're good at it, but they've been given the wrong problems to solve. They get huge pressure for highway capacity to focus on that. And it's up to this grouping of people to start to broaden the language of what the tools that are really needed are. And if any one thing that COVID is teaching us, it's we were in a trench for a long time. It's time to get out of that trench, design downtown streets and any streets for the appropriate speed, for the appropriate social engagement in life. And I think it's a new era. It's the most exciting era that we can be entering when it comes to redesigning our cities for people and place first.
Thanks, Dan. I think we'll have one last question for today, and we'll hold the rest for next time. My city has an arterial that has extremely wide lanes and has experienced 3 fatalities in the last 2 years. It carries about 25,000 vehicles a day. The state has designated it as a freight route and will resist narrowing the lanes to less than 11 feet. But we have other roads in town that have 10-foot lanes and carry large trucks just fine. Do you ever encounter a compelling case for vehicle travel lanes any wider than 10 feet?
I wonder if I could start, because Florida now is really changing the name, the game. When we can, based on the speed that we need to handle, 10 foot is quite adequate. It's all based on every factor in the world. How much transit are you running? How much freight? But we should be looking at the minimum width first, and then give ourselves permission to go up to 11 when we need. And in fact, we're working on a project right now where they want 11-foot lanes, And we're saying, and for transit reasons, we say, well, fine, keep 11 for the outer lane, but that doesn't mean you need 11 foot for the center of the 2 lanes going in one direction. I know that the research is out there that narrower lanes are safer in the right context. And so, yeah, we're in a transition period. Mark, what would you add to that?
I was just going to say the biggest breakthrough I'll often have when I'm working with engineers on this kind of stuff is to sort of get out of the box that every lane has to be identically the same, right? Why do I need 3 11s or 3 12s when in fact we do need an 11 here that it's a transit lane? Or you could have a truck only lane. You could say the trucks can only be in lane X marked thus, because by the way, on turning movements, that's the lane they're going to be turning from. So, you know, that lane is an 11 or even 11.5 foot lane if that's really, really necessary. But not every lane has to be, right? Because every extra foot you add to the corridor, we know tends to invite more speed. So getting creative, and this is the biggest, this is an underlying principle. It's not just about lane width. Get the engineers and designers, whoever's got responsibility, to go back to their roots, their foundation, because I agree with Dan that a lot of people enter this field because they want to design solutions. So say, design a solution, and that means use your creativity. The guidebooks are often not mandating. If you look at the language closely, it's suggested, this is recommended, but it doesn't say every lane must be 12 feet for all 3 lanes of this corridor if the speeds are above 40 miles an hour. What it says is, you know, this is recommended for this condition. You can change that condition, right? You can say, well, I don't actually want people going 40 here. I want, we're going to post at 35 or 30, and this is the behavior we want, and we should make the lanes reflect that. So kind of getting engineers to work backwards from outcomes. Here's the outcome I want. Now I'm going to design this to give me that outcome versus the other way, which is you got this much traffic and it goes this fast. Guess I got to open everything up. Those are 2 different ways to think about it.
And I would just underscore that context piece that both Dan and Mark brought up, because I think one of the things that we don't want to do is make the lane width the one and only thing that we're considering, right? And that as we think about what that visual indicator is, what we're designing for, that we don't keep the conversation just to a segment or to a width, because I think in those situations where you do need that extra foot, you know, there should be more to that conversation. So I'm just going to highlight that and leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Danny. So I think we'll wrap up for today because, like I said, we are talking about doing a 3rd section with you. Just wanted to put the option here for any closing thoughts from what we talked about today.
I just want to thank you guys again. It's wonderful to be able to reach this kind of an audience. Great group, great questions. You know, the quality of the questions tells me that, you know, we've got a very thoughtful group. So thanks for the great work that you and John do. There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that gets us to this moment. We're very appreciative.
Yeah, I echo that, Michael and John, thank you.
Yeah,
and everyone
and
who attended.
likewise, this is an amazing string of conversations you guys have created, and what I most love about it is the rich diversity of people that join these calls. It's just amazing. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all. This will conclude our webinar today, Walkability and Health, Building Strong, Vibrant, and Resilient Communities. I'd like to offer a big thank you to Dan Burden, Mark Fenton, and Danny Schaeffner for a great presentation, to all of you who attended, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology expert who makes this all happen behind the scenes. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org in the coming days. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email if you need that type of documentation. When you leave today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And please join us Monday as we kick off Planning with Purpose, a Smart Growth Network webinar series on community revitalization. The Smart Growth Network is working with the Maryland Department of Planning to launch a series of programs through the rest of the year examining how smart growth strategies can help to mitigate current issues and provide opportunities for smart growth advocates to learn from their counterparts in adjacent fields. The first program will feature an overview of economic development of the U.S. Economic Development Administration's CARES Act Recovery Assistance with staff from USEDA. The registration will be available later today. Watch for your email inbox and at smartgrowth.org for details on this and other future webinars, including upcoming programs that we have planned in July and the third part of this series with the Blue Zones team. Thank you and have a great day.